Got it.
Okay, perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm here today with Sheila Regehr, who is the president of the Basic Income Canada Network. Thanks for joining us today, Sheila. Can you start by telling us what basic income is?
I think the best way to describe basic income in Canada is to look at programs that we've got that are very like basic income in many ways. And that's primarily benefits for seniors through old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, and a sort of partial basic income that we have for families with children. Um, the way it works is that the money is unconditional. It provides a level of adequacy that's based on something real, unlike some of our other programs who just make things up, and the dollar amount nowhere reflects what's actually needed. So it gives people options. It gives them the freedom to make their own decisions about how they balance all the demands of their lives, from employment to work for their families, community, civic engagement, those sorts of things. And we see that like it's worked really well for seniors. It's drastically reduced and maintained low poverty levels for that group. Seniors are able to be more engaged, not saying that their adequacy levels are, perfect at this point, but it provides that level of security that so many other Canadians are lacking.
Right. And you've touched on this a little bit, but you have years of experience looking at social assistance programs as the director of the National Council of Welfare. Can you talk about how social assistance is different from basic income and how the outcomes for people on social assistance are different from what we see with the basic income like programs in Canada?
Right. So the National Council of Welfare produced welfare incomes reports for years. And one of the most depressing things that we saw about this every time we issued it was that there were little changes here and there. In some jurisdictions, things would get a little bit better for a couple of years, but in other jurisdictions, they would get worse. Despite, in Ontario, for example, there have been all kinds of reviews of social assistance. Nothing ever got sustainably better. One of the other problems, in addition to the well-known one about like desperately low levels of income that people just can't survive on, is the fact that those rules change all the time. People never quite know what to expect. People are vulnerable to the whims of the bureaucrats sometimes in deciding what they're eligible for. And even a lot of the public servants who really are trying to help are hamstrung by these rule books that prevent them from providing what people really need. And then if we turn away from the economics of things and look to other disciplines that we don't do often enough, like public health, like psychology and neuroscience, we know that the way you treat people, if you suspect them all the time, if there's stigma around the receipt of income, if you take control away from people so they can't make their own decisions, none of that argues for human well-being and the ability for people to get ahead. What we see in these other programs, existing ones like child benefits that took lots of families off of social assistance, seniors benefits, which continues to do that as soon as somebody reaches 65, and the pilots that have been conducted in Canada and around the world all show a very consistent pattern of benefits. Health gets better, educational outcomes are better, crime goes down, intrafamily violence reduces, there's less, alcohol consumption. There's more civic engagement. People are able to combine their various work responsibilities. Some people volunteered more. Other people were able to go from a dead end job to getting a better one. It's just there are options there that aren't available to people now.
Right. And this is something that we've tried before. As you've mentioned, there have been pilot projects in Canada and around the world. Can you tell us what the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project was?
The Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project was something that we hoped, that many of us hoped, was going to give us a lot of really, really solid evidence to convince politicians that this mattered. But the genesis of it really was a commitment, I think, on the part of some key individuals that we really do need to change. You can't keep doing things the same way And we needed to try a very different way of providing income support to people. So the pilot was run, I think it was 2017 to 2019. There were overall over 6,000 participants. Some were a control group. 4,000 people received benefits. It was rolled out in 3 different sites, Hamilton being a major one, Lindsay being interesting because a larger proportion of the population got benefits. So it was almost like a saturation site, the kind that we saw in Dauphin, Manitoba in the 1970s. So we hope to get a lot of information on what happens in communities like Lindsay when more people have better income security. And in Hamilton, you know, following people and seeing what happens in their individual lives. So unfortunately, history of Manitoba repeated itself in Ontario, and there was a change in government despite promises of everybody, all parties going into the election that they would honor the pilot. The incoming Conservative government canceled it with very specious reasons. As you mentioned, I am a former federal public servant. Nobody makes decisions based on data that arrives in 2 days. Things don't happen that fast. So the idea that was proposed that it wasn't working and whatever, it was just nonsense. We were really fortunate at BICN with our Ontario equivalent that we had our own sort of database. Like we had lots of people who volunteered to tell us about their experiences, to be, you know, part of the evidence of this project even after it was canceled. So we got to survey them. Other academics at McMaster and different universities also developed studies and went in depth looking at what happened. And again, as I said, we saw the same pattern. I mean, the specifics are different in every case. One of the things that really jumped out to me, and given some of the headlines we've seen lately, it just is a shame we don't have a basic income now. But the baseline survey that they conducted of people going into the pilot project showed extraordinarily high amounts of depression, anxiety, you know, various measures of psychological distress. We were quite astounded by that number. We were also astounded when we discovered how quickly a lot of that distress dissipated. And we were expecting good things to happen. But we got stories of people who reduced medication, got off medication entirely, got back to work again because their health improved, were able to eat better, and everything else flowed from there. So, you know, the speed with which we can turn things around just makes it so critical that we get this thing going soon because so many lives can be saved.
Right. And speaking of speed, we saw another accidental experiment with CERB when thousands of people were laid off or saw their hours of work reduced with very little warning, and the federal government was able to roll out these emergency benefits with very little time and preparation. And we saw what a significant difference that made in the lives of people. Can you talk a little bit about what outcomes BICN saw from the CERB program and what that might suggest for a basic income?
Right. So we surveyed people within our realm kind of thing in our database. And so we got a lot of really good stories of people. One of the things that struck me most was how many people talked about having breathing room. That, you know, this gave them the opportunities to stop and think about, am I really in the right job for me? You know, when I can go back to work, is this something that's going to work for me, or can I take this period of time to start moving towards something else that's going to give me better long-term prospects? So that was, you know, one of the things that we discovered. The other thing that really struck me was how concerned people receiving CERB were for people who weren't eligible. So many people, despite all of this rhetoric about leaving no one behind, people were deliberately left behind. Like, let's make no mistake about that. People were deliberately left behind. And our survey respondents were really worried about them. But now we've got, really good data from Stats Can that's starting to come in that's showing clearly what happened during the period when CERB benefits were received by people. And we see, quite significant reductions in poverty, reductions in depth of poverty, reductions in racial inequality. So we see this pattern, and the poverty reduction figures, quite interestingly, surpassed the government's longer-term poverty, the federal government's longer-term poverty reduction goals, which shows we're being way too modest. We can do things way better, way faster. We know how to do this. We have to put our political minds to doing it.
Yes, it reminds me of the graph for seniors poverty. When you see the introduction of old age security and GIS, it's like a roller coaster that's reached its peak, and there's this abrupt plummet.
Yeah.
We absolutely know what works. It's just time for governments to find the political will to do it.
Exactly. So I'm encouraged a bit that I think there is a lot of work going on within the federal government looking at CERB and its impacts and learning a lot. And as you said, it was, an experiment just designed on the fly kind of thing. And we even met with the minister. We told her, like you don't expect something to be perfect when you're suddenly hit with something and you're in a crisis. There was a lot that was good in CERB. There was a lot that was really flawed. Let's sort out which was which, and let's find something permanent so we don't keep doing things on the fly all the time, because that will cause problems.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today to help us better understand basic income, Sheila.
Thank you, Chandra. My pleasure.
I'm going to stop the recording.